everyone, and welcome to this episode of Ding and the Quiz is Done. Before we go any further, pause the video and do the quiz. Okay, so we're continuing our look at the relationship between Norman kings and the church. And today we are going to enrich our understanding of that balance of power between the church and Norman kings by having a look at three different events. Now, these three events don't just include William the Conqueror, they also include his son, William II, and they include another William as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. And the whole point of this is for us to look at the general relationship between the church and Norman kings, but also looking at how this relationship changed between William the Conqueror and William II. So, let's switch to our sheet. So for each one of these events, I've given you a really short blurb, and then what I would like you to do is, after reading it, we'll read through it together, is I'd like you to tell me what this conflict shows about the relationship between the crown and the church. Now, when doing this, you should also be thinking about the relationship that we've already looked at through things like the purging of the church or l'enfance reforms to the church. Right, let's get my ruler, she says, which has disappeared off the face of the earth. Okay. Ah, no, there it is. There it is. And let's read our first one, which is about Bishop Odo of Bayeux in 1076. Actually, before we do that, just really quickly, let's go through our keywords. So, reprisal is an act against a person or group which is usually seen as a punishment for something. Quite often, if you say that it's a reprisal, it's this idea that it's not kind of officially allowed. To be pious is to be extremely religious. A pallium is a piece of clothing worn by the Pope or leaders of the Catholic Church in different regions. To be secular is to not be connected with religion, so secular courts were courts that weren't church courts. And to do something surreptitiously is doing something in a way that attempts to avoid notice or attention. Okay, Bishop Odo of Bayeux in 1076. In 1076, a church council at Winchester extended the power of church courts, stating that, from that point on, only church courts had the power to put members of the clergy on trial. You remember that before this point, after the Council of Winchester in 1070, church courts had the ability to hear spiritual crimes, but it didn't necessarily mean that if you were a member of the clergy, you would definitely end up in a church court. This has expanded that power. It appears that this decision was soon put to the test, as historians believe that in the same year Bishop Odo of Bayeux was put on trial by the king at the trial of Penderdon Heath. Odo was accused by both Lanfranc and the king of stealing lands from the crown and the Diocese of Canterbury. A diocese is like a bishopric. However, rather than trying Odo as a bishop, although he was technically a bishop of a diocese in France, he was tried as the Earl of Kent. Odo was found guilty, and a large amount of property was restored to the church and the crown. So, when we say that he was tried as the Earl of Kent, that means that he was tried in a secular court. He wasn't tried in a church court. Okay, so pause the video. What does this incident tell us about the relationship and that power balance between the crown and the church? Okay, let's have a look at what I've written. So I focused mainly on how William approached the church, and I've spoken about this idea that William was willing to disobey church laws, but he wasn't willing to do so obviously. If he did it fairly surreptitiously, or he tried to find what's called a loophole. He tried to find something that would allow him to do what he wanted, even though he wasn't supposed to. So, William was willing to disobey the church, but he didn't do it blatantly. Okay, so why does this event prove that point, that William was willing to disobey the church, but he wasn't willing to do it blatantly? So what you've got here is a bishop who has committed a crime against the church and against the crown, and according to the Council of Winchester, that bishop should be tried in a church court. William didn't want that. William wanted this man tried in his court, in the king's court. So he needed to find a way around this, and he did. He found a loophole, and the loophole was that Odo was a bishop, but he was also the Earl of Kent. And so William essentially said, okay, well, I'm not trying you in your role as a bishop, I'm trying you in your role as an earl. And earls aren't members of the church, and so I'm free to try you in the king's court. He is pretty much disobeyed the decision of the Council of Winchester, but he's finding a good reason why he can do it. There is a really similar example to this that we can see in 1070 when William purges the church. He's got a number of people in the church that he wants to get rid of because they are a political threat. He doesn't blatantly go out and say, you're a political threat and I want to get rid of you. Instead, he tries to use a legitimate reason decided by the church in order to make that look as though that's the main reason he's getting rid of them. So Leothwine is a great example. Leothwine had connections with earls in Mercia. William wanted to get rid of him, and it appears as though he got rid of him for politics, but then used the religious reason of a lack of celibacy to justify his choice. So link to Leothwine and purging the church. Now, just because obviously I'm able to type more quickly than I'm able to write, this is what I put on my teacher copy. William was willing to disobey church laws, but he wasn't willing to do so blatantly. He found a loophole which allowed him to try Odo in a secular court. William therefore recognised the potential influence of the church. He recognised the power it had, and so he didn't want to go out of his way to just blatantly disobey them. And then linking to Bishop Leothwine. Okay, so our next event is the Bishop of Durham. Now, he's called William of Calais, but I have mainly referred to him as the Bishop of Durham throughout in order to stop the confusion of the fact that we've got William the Conqueror, William II, and William of Calais. Get the ruler. 3 years after William the Conqueror's death, William of Calais, the Bishop of Durham, participated in a rebellion against the king. The king in this case is now William II. The king put the bishop on trial. The bishop refused to accept the court's authority, stating that he should be tried in a church court as he was a member of the clergy. He appealed to other bishops to support him, but fearing reprisals from the king, they refused to do so. The bishop was found guilty and was exiled to Normandy. Pope Urban II wrote to King William II, urging him to restore William of Calais as Bishop of Durham. However, King William refused to do so. Okay, so we do have a different king now. We've got William the Conqueror, who was willing to disobey the church, but he wasn't willing to do it blatantly. Now we have his son in power. So it is going to be slightly different. So exactly the same as you did before. Pause the video and then write down what this conflict tells you about the changing relationship between the king and the church. Okay, so I've made 2 points here. I'm just going to hide one of them so that I can talk about them one at a time. My first point is that William's son, William II, was much more willing to openly define or disobey the church than his father. If we compare these two events, Bishop Odo of Bayeux and the Bishop of Durham, it's a similar situation. Both of them have committed a crime that meant that the king wanted to try them as a layman, as somebody outside the church. And in the case of William the Conqueror found that loophole, the fact that he was the Earl of Kent, and used that to justify trying him in his court. William II didn't do that. William II simply said, "You have disobeyed me, and therefore I will put you on trial." And this shows a much more confident role, or a much more confident attitude that William II appears to have towards the church and disobeying the church. And that leads into our second point. One of the reasons why William II may have been more confident, it was his personality. He was generally a lot more kind of brash and over the top than his father, but it also demonstrates the fact that the Pope's influence appeared to be in decline. The Pope was less powerful in this period of history. William II ignored the Pope and did not experience significant consequences. Yeah, the Pope directly wrote to William II, and William just refused to do so. And the other bishops in England were called on to support William of Calais, chose not to do so because they feared reprisals from King William, which shows us that these bishops weren't expecting to get support, or at least significant support, from the Pope. So on the one hand, William appears a lot more confident, a lot more powerful in relation to the Church, and the Catholic Church, and specifically the Pope, appears a lot less powerful. Okay, let's go to our third event. And this one happens in 1089. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII banned kings from appointing bishops and abbots without papal permission. This is part of the papal reform movement that I spoke about in our feedback lesson. This was called the Investiture Controversy. 14 years later, Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, died. William II refused to allow the appointment of another archbishop. Instead, he kept the church lands and their income for himself and the crown. 4 years later, the king fell ill, and he still had control of this bishopric. Believing his illness to be a punishment from God, he agreed to appoint the pious Anselm as the Archbishop of Canterbury, meaning extremely religious, a choice approved by the Pope. However, William insisted that he had to be the one to officially award Anselm the role and give him his pallium. So giving the Archbishop of Canterbury this robe was part of the ceremony of officially giving them the role. Anselm refused. He wished to travel to Rome to be given his pallium by the Pope. William refused. Other bishops feared reprisals from William and so refused to support Anselm. Ultimately, both sides reached an odd compromise. Anselm performed the ceremony on himself. So a lot of this is about symbolism. By giving Anselm the pallium, William is saying, I am the one with the power, I am the one who's giving you this role. By insisting that the Pope give him the pallium, Anselm is saying the power doesn't come from the king, it comes from the Pope. And then we have a situation where neither side wins and Anselm performs the ceremony on himself. So, once again, what does this conflict show us about the relationship between the crown and the church? Okay, again we've got 2 points, and they're fairly similar points to what we saw in our previous conflict between William II and the Pope. William's son was willing to openly disobey the Pope. Despite a clear decision from the Pope about the investiture controversy, William II was willing to openly and repeatedly disobey the Pope. He refused to appoint the new Archbishop of Canterbury in the first place, and then he refused to allow Anselm to travel to Rome. He's essentially saying, I'm the one who decides who the Archbishop of Canterbury is, and if my decision is that there's not going to be one, that's what's going to happen. Now, it's important to note, this doesn't mean that William II doesn't believe in God, or didn't believe in God. I mean, the fact that the reason why he changed his mind and he decided to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury, and a pious one at that, was because he feared that his disease was a punishment from God, shows that he did believe in God, but there's that separation between God and the organisation of the church. Okay, and there we go. Our second point then. Again, the Pope's influence appeared to be in decline, similar to what we said before. The Pope is less powerful. It was only the fear of punishment from God which caused William II to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury. So the investiture controversy was in 1075. That's when the decision was made. 14 years later, so this rule was well in effect when Lanfranc died, and William still allowed himself 4 years of collecting money from these areas of land that had previously been in the bishopric of Canterbury. So we've got 2 rulers who have a fairly different approach to the Pope and to the Church generally. So what I'd like us to do now, let's switch back to our visualizer, is I'd like you to kind of summarise the relationship of these two kings with the church. And when I say the church, I mean the church in England and I mean the Pope. So, particularly when we're doing this first one, the relationship between William the Conqueror and the church, I don't want you just to think about today's lesson and that first incident with Bishop Odo of Bayeux. I want you to think about previous lessons where we've looked at Lanfranc's reforms and we've also looked at the purging of church leadership in 1070. So pause the video and then answer the question using these pieces of vocabulary in your answer. The only thing to note is to defy is to disobey somebody openly, and to consolidate is to strengthen. So to strengthen your grip on something. Okay, pause the video, do that now. Okay, so usually I would now be asking people for some of their answers. Obviously I don't have access to your answers at the moment, so we're just going to have a look at mine, which is this section here. William the Conqueror recognised that support from the Pope had been important in winning the Battle of Hastings. He also realised that the Church in England was important to maintain his control over England. As a result, William encouraged reforms which brought the English Church in line with the papal reform movement, and he was unwilling to openly defy the Church. However, he also abused loopholes where possible and appeared to surreptitiously use the Church to consolidate his control over England. So remember this idea of purging the Church and replacing them with Normans who would be likely to be loyal to the king. So there's a lot in there. First of all, I've started with this idea of motivation. William was a religious man, but he was also a man who recognised the important political and military power of the church, and that is reflected in his approach. So on the one hand, he did encourage reforms that were in line with the papal reform movement. After all, he personally appointed Lanfranc as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Lanfranc brought in a lot of reforms like discouraging the worship of relics and saints. But ultimately he didn't want to outwardly, obviously disobey the church. That doesn't mean that he didn't, it just meant that when he did it quietly. And that demonstrates that kind of respect and the recognition of the power of the church. Okay, now I'm not going to reveal the next one. So what I now want you to do is have a look at those two events. So the Bishop of Durham in 1088 and then Anselm in 1089, and I want you to describe the relationship between William II and the church. So use these terms, pause the video and write your answer. Okay, we're going to do exactly what we just did before and have a look at my answer. William II was willing to openly defy the church and did not recognise the authority of the Pope in England. He believed in God and recognised his ability to punish people. Now, when I say his, you'll notice I used a capital H. That's because I'm referring to the Christian God. So he recognised God's ability to punish people. However, that respect did not extend to the church in England or internationally. Essentially, he believed in God, he believed in the ability of God to punish people, but he didn't believe in the authority or respect the authority of the church. So we've got two kings with different approaches, and we're going to use that to look at an interpretation that we've already looked at. Now you'll notice that the question I'm asking you is slightly different. A couple of lessons ago I asked you how convincing is interpretation A about William the Conqueror's relationship over the church. I'm also going to correct that. There we go. There we go. So, whereas now I'm asking you how convincing is interpretation A about Norman kings' power over the church. And I don't know why I emphasise power, because that's not what I wanted to emphasise. What I wanted to emphasise was that we're not just talking about William the Conqueror now, we're also talking about William II. And this is going to allow you to construct really quite a complex argument, because I would argue that depending on which Norman king you're looking at, this interpretation is either more or less convincing. So what I would do is I would write one paragraph applying this interpretation to William the Conqueror, and then I would write one paragraph applying this interpretation to William II, and that allows you to be really quite sophisticated and say, well, you know, to an extent we could argue that this is convincing in relation to this king. However, if you look at this king, it is arguably less convincing, and here's why. That's a really lovely nuanced argument. So that's what I want you doing now. Before you do so, go back to the marking and the feedback that I gave you the first time you had a look at this interpretation, because this is also a really good opportunity for you to practice those areas that I told you to focus on. So, check your answer from a couple of lessons ago first, then 10 minutes on your own, 2 paragraphs. Once you're done, take a photo of your work, email it to me, and I will send you some feedback. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.